Athens and Jerusalem seminar lecture. We each semester have a common read that faculty and students have the chance to engage in and have discussion groups. We try to choose a text that helps us think through the nature and purpose of Christian higher education at Indiana Wesleyan University. This semester we had almost 100 faculty and students involved in the discussion groups in what was a very engaging text, one that was very timely for many things that we have going on, including General Education Task Force. And despite the reformed nature of our author's school, very much resonated with the Wesleyan heritage of this institution. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. One, we should have about 10 minutes or so for Q&A after all is done. There'll be the presentation, there'll be a brief response, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A. If you want to ask questions, just come up to the microphones and you can do that there. The other thing is that we are going to do the best we can to be done by 5. Might be 5:03 or so since we're starting a few minutes late. But please be courteous to the speakers, be courteous to the event in terms of making sure that we don't get too restless and recognize that we will make sure that we're not here until 6 o'clock, okay? All right, I'm going to invite Emily Hathaway to come up. She's the chaplain of the Honors College Student Association to ask the Lord's blessing on our time.
Please pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you this afternoon, ultimately to honor you. We pray that as we discuss your kingdom, you would grant us growth in the nourishment of our minds and the movement of our hearts. Bless Dr. Smith and Dr. Levering as they share with us this afternoon. Thank you for all that you are. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit we pray. Amen.
Hello, my name is Kay Oliver, and I am here today to introduce the two speakers that we will be hearing from. The first is Dr. James Smith, as you've already heard. He comes to us today from Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he serves as an associate professor of philosophy, as well as the director of Calvin's Seminar in Christian Scholarship. He is originally from Canada, and he is currently fathering 4 children with his wife, Deanna. He has numerous published works, including Who's Afraid of Postmodernism and The Devil Reads Derrida. So, he will be speaking and sharing with us on Desiring the Kingdom, Worship, Worldview, and Cultural Formation, which is the first in a series he started on cultural liturgies. So, the respondent for this afternoon is Dr. Matthew Levering. He comes to us. He is serving as the professor of theology at the University of Dayton. He has individually authored a number of works. These include Biblical Natural Law, a theocentric and teleological approach, as well as Sacrifice and Community, Jewish Offering, and Christian Eucharist. So please welcome with me our speakers for the evening.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming. Thanks very much for the warm hospitality I always enjoy at Indiana Wesleyan. I think it was the last time I was here, I think it was Keith Drury, who said if you take a Calvinist and a Pentecostal and cross them, you get a Wesleyan. And so I'm very happy to be an honorary Wesleyan. When I go to a national meeting called the American Academy of Religion, I often attend the Wesleyan Theological Society reception. And you know I don't go there for the beer. And it's because I value those conversations. I hope some of you, do folks have an outline to help you doodle as you're otherwise following along? I actually want to start with a little case study. I was just teaching this text and it struck me that it captures a lot of the things that I'm trying to talk about in Desiring the Kingdom. This comes from St. Augustine's Confessions, which is a book you should all read before you leave Indiana Wesleyan University. Nobody has a right to call themselves an educated Christian who has not read Augustine's Confessions. And then don't sell it back to the textbook store, just keep it for later. This is a little episode from Book 6 of the Confessions. This is one of Augustine's best friends named Olympius. And the context of this little scene that I want to read with you is Alypius is actually quite a successful lawyer, rhetor, is starting to make his way and is becoming a success in the world. But he has this penchant for gladiatorial games and the spectacle of them, and this distraction and this temptation really sort of sucks him away from himself. And I keep trying to think of a contemporary analog of that sort of thing. We don't have gladiatorial games anymore. I mean, we do have like the NFL. We also have Xbox. So Xbox in the dorms might actually be equivalent to the sort of temptation and challenge that Alypius is facing here. And in this little scene, a bunch of so-called friends have accosted Alypius and are dragging him away to the gladiatorial games. And here's how we pick it up. Read with me. He said, Alypius said, "If you drag my body to that place and sit me down there, do not imagine that you can turn my mind and eyes to those spectacles. I shall be as one not there, and so I shall overcome both you and the games." He kept his eyes shut and forbade his mind to think about such fearful evils. Would that he had blocked his ears as well. A man fell in combat, right? Think Gladiator movie here, okay? A man fell in combat. A great roar from the entire crowd struck him with such vehemence that he was overcome by curiosity. Supposing himself strong enough to despise whatever he saw and to conquer it, he opened his eyes. He was struck in the soul by a wound graver than the gladiator in his body. He was not now the person who had come in, but was just one of the crowd. Now, I'm describing this as Alypius' conceit for this reason. Alypius made two fatal errors here. The first is he underestimated the power of the rituals of the gladiatorial games. He underestimated the visceral, affective influence that participating in that spectacle had on him. The other mistake he made is he thought that there was some sort of disconnect between his mind and his body. Right? Do you notice what he says there? He says, fine, you can take my body, you can take my eyes, you can take my ears, you can take me with all my senses, you can plunk me right down in the middle of this spectacle. But it won't matter because I shall be as one not there, I shall overcome you, I'm going to forbid my mind to think about these things. Was he successful? No. Why? Because we are not this mind that are just contained in a body. The link between our embodiment and our imaginations and the way we understand the world and ourselves is much more intimately connected. And what this story shows us, in fact, is that all of the material, visceral, sensible, and sensual practices that we immerse ourselves in, those are the conduits to our heart and mind and imagination. The body is not just some vehicle that's tracking our mind around. The body is who we are. And so the picture that arises from this is that the material practices, the visceral and tangible places that we put ourselves actually seep into us through that bodily participation. And it's something like that picture that really motivates a lot of what I'm trying to do in this book that some of you have been reading called Desiring the Kingdom. Desiring the Kingdom really is just my best attempt to try to keep up with St. Augustine. I think in the 21st century, we could be doing nothing better than trying to catch up to a 5th century African bishop who had a lot of wisdom about what it looks like to be faithful disciples, what it looks like to be wise disciples, what it looks like to be engaged in Christian education and formation. And so in a lot of ways, I think of Desiring the Kingdom as a sort of translation of Augustine for the 21st century. I mean, that's actually claiming too much for myself, but it's that sort of project. So what I want to do with you in the time that we have today is sketch a little bit of an overview of that argument, that project. And in particular, I want to focus on the picture of the human person that's at work there. And then I want to bring it around to think about some of the implications of that. So let's first of all think about this first point. We are what we love. One of the things I'm challenging, dealing with, working against, is actually how we picture ourselves. How we picture what kinds of creatures and animals we are. And I'm convinced that in an important and maybe even in a strange sort of way, we, and by we I mean we North American evangelical Christians for the most part, actually in a strange way tend to think of ourselves as thinking things. That is, we've developed a sense that what defines us is what we believe, what we know, what our doctrines are, what the ideas are that define us. And that comes from, in some sense, having bought into a picture of human persons. It's a sort of, I call it sometimes a bobblehead picture of the human person. You know those bobblehead dolls you get when you go to the ballpark? Where the head is this humongous head on this tiny little body. And it's as if we have this sort of strange, distorted picture of human persons that we are primarily sort of thinking, cognitive, rational animals. And therefore, we underestimate, in fact, the role of the body. Now, when we have that sort of picture of what human persons are, you also end up coming up with a rendition or an understanding of Christianity that's consonant with that. And you think about Christianity as primarily a set of ideas, doctrines, and beliefs. St. Augustine, he's not opposed to thinking, not opposed to knowledge, not opposed to beliefs, not even opposed to doctrine. But what he would say is, before you have any of that stuff, you have love. Now, this isn't, I don't mean Hallmark, soppy love. I don't mean Oprah love. I don't, I mean, everything that you know about love, in a way, I want you to kind of forget. Because the way our culture thinks about love is this sort of warm, fuzzy. When St. Augustine talks about love, what he means is this. The first paragraph of the Confessions, Augustine summarizes by saying, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." What's interesting there is that Augustine pictures the seat and core of the human person, not primarily in the intellect, not because he's opposed to the intellect, but what he's saying is the core and center of who I am is actually located in the heart. And again, this isn't Hallmark heart. This is the heart as the center of what I desire, my passions, my longing. And so what Augustine says is we have been made by God to be the kind of people who find ourselves and find our identity precisely in what we love. Not primarily and not fundamentally in what we know or think, but fundamentally in what we love. In fact, what we love shapes and conditions and influences what we think. So love comes first. And that's how we've been made. We've been those are the sorts of creatures we are. Those are the sorts of animals that we are. So for St. Augustine, and I think more generically we can come up with a picture that sees what defines you. If I want to know what really defines you, what makes you who you are, I'm not primarily going to ask you what you know or what you think. I'm going to ask what you love. When I ask what you love, what I mean is, what gets you out of bed in the morning? I mean, other than, doormate who's snoring. I mean, think of it this way. What you love is what pulls you to what matters, right? What you love here is not what you have warm, fuzzy feelings about. What you love is precisely what you desire ultimately. What do you think the good life looks like? think human flourishing looks like? What do you want more than anything? It's that picture of love. That's why in this little diagram that I've got here, what I want you to have is a picture of the human person that isn't just the static container for a bunch of ideas, but rather this dynamic picture that we are lovers. We are made to be lovers. We are defined by what we love. And that love is always aimed at some end, some vision of the good life, some vision of what we could call for shorthand, the kingdom. Right? And that is operative at a level that isn't primarily cognitive or intellectual. It's operative at a level that is more affective. It's operative at a level of desire. In fact, to the point that you might tell me one thing about what you love, but if I look at what you're doing, it shows me that you love something else. Because that you're doing is going to be an important part of this. So we are what we love. Our identity is bound up with our desire, our longings. To the extent that, in fact, if you ask St. Augustine, what is the effect of sin on this creational structure? God has, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. God has created us as these sorts of lovers. The effect of sin on that is not that you stop loving. The effect of the fall is not that it turns off your love. You can't not love. The effect of the fall is you start loving everything else. you start, I think it's an old Eddie Rabbit song, looking for love in all the wrong places. I'm not going to sing it for you, but this is also the entire corpus of U2 is about this dynamic, where you still haven't found what you're looking for, all that you can't leave behind. That is, you are defined by love, and you will be looking for love somewhere, and you'll be loving something. So that love can't be turned off, it can only be disordered. It can only be misdirected. So when in the beginning of the Confessions, Augustine says, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you, that restlessness, that anxiety, that angst, is precisely the experience of a creature whose love isn't settling on the thing it's meant for. And the entirety of the Confessions is analyzing that dynamic. Now, here's what I'm interested in. What you love, what sort of pulls you out of bed, what makes you come to college, what makes you do all these sorts of things. That love it's not magic. It's not an accident. It's not the fruit of some decision you make at some point. The aiming of your love is primed and pointed and shaped and molded by very specific practices that you are immersed in. Okay? So your love, we're not talking primarily about an emotion that you work up. We're talking about this deep, fundamental passion that moves you through the world. And the product and aiming of that passion happens through our immersion in very concrete practices, rituals, what we could call liturgies. Right? Those, this opening story of Olympias? What the story is showing us is the very visceral, sensible practices that Olympias was inserted in sort of got to his heart through those very material communal practices. There's an old saying that we don't say anymore. The way to a man's heart is through his stomach, okay? Which is probably still true, but in a way, the thesis here is that the way to our heart is through our body. That the way our love gets primed and pointed and aimed and shaped is through material, physical rituals and practices that we are immersed in. This isn't magic. Now, how are we doing? Is everybody with me? The problem is, what that love gets aimed at are some very different visions of human flourishing. Right? So if every sort of fundamental love is ultimately aimed at some vision of human flourishing, some vision of, let's call it the kingdom, not all kingdoms are the same, right? There are different, competing, and even radically antithetical versions and visions of what human flourishing looks like. And some practices are loaded to make you the kind of person who loves that vision of the kingdom. And other practices are primed and loaded to make you the kind of person who is disposed to love this version of the kingdom. And oftentimes, those visions are going to be in tension and even antithesis. So part of what I'm interested in is us recognizing the differences between those visions of the kingdom. Let me say a second feature of this. So love is who we are. You are what you love. You are what you eat. You are what you love. Right? That sort of principle. That's what defines you. What you think, what you believe, what you know are all important. But in fact, they are embedded in and they are the fruit of what you love. And what you love is more fundamental. Secondly, what moves us? Now, the other thing that I want us to appreciate, if you get away from Alypius's dualism, right? If you get away from Alypius's mistaken idea that somehow his mind was insulated from his body, if you get away from that and you appreciate that we are lovers, what we also then have to appreciate is that what governs your action, what governs your action is not, this is where people get nervous about this for some reason. I'm not exactly sure why, but what governs your action is not, for the most part, conscious decisions. Okay? Contemporary cognitive psychology and cognitive science actually tells us that you make your way in the world about 97% of the time without thinking about what you're doing. Now, let me explain. What do we mean? And I think this is another fabulous feature of the kinds of animals God has made us. Okay? There is a way in which we absorb a comportment to the world. We absorb a way of being in the world that drives our action, and it becomes so absorbed in who we are that you don't have to consciously think about what you're doing. Right? Let me give you, this is in cognitive psychology, this is called automaticity. Automation, and it gives rise to automaticities. Just think automation kinds of language. Think of it this way. Do you remember learning to drive a car? Right? When you first learned how to drive a car, you had to think about everything. Right? Every little thing. And that's what makes it so scary for your parents sitting beside you. Okay? Is because you're having to think about everything. Check the mirror. Check the mirror. Check the mirror. Look ahead. Check the mirror. Blind spot. Check. Right? It's all, in other words, all of the action of driving a car when you were first learning it is all in what we could call occurrent consciousness. It's conscious deliberation. Then you get old and fat like me, and you can drive home, and you don't even remember. Do you know what I mean? Like you get home, and that's not because of any other conditions, but you just drive home from work, and you were thinking about St. Augustine the whole way home, and then all of a sudden you're in your driveway, and you're like, man, I seriously don't remember driving home. Why? Because all of those things that originally you had to be consciously thinking about have become automated, right? That they have sort of seeped into what psychologists now call the cognitive unconscious, right? Or the automated or the adaptive unconscious. And now, it's like there's this sort of register, there's this black box within us that drives our behavior, for the most part, in ways that are automated, and you don't have to think about it. In fact, there's a really interesting study at the University of Virginia where somebody had lost that capacity and actually had to think about everything. So standing here right now, that person would have to think about lock the knees, hold your weight, and had to whereas I can do all this and I'm not thinking about any of except what I'm saying to you right now. But imagine if you lost all of those abilities for automation, right? You can't stand up unless you concentrate. Now, here's what I think is interesting about that. First of all, I think that cognitive psychology picture that we now have confirms a lot of what the Christian tradition has always known about liturgical practices and spiritual disciplines. Right? The whole point of liturgical practices and spiritual disciplines was to, in a way, get the gospel to seep into being part of the very core and fiber of your being, so that you just became the kind of person who responded in this way. You just became the kind of person who loved the kingdom, right? And that behavior, in a way, comes to you automatically. The way this love works then is that it's what we love doesn't push us into action. Rather, what we love, what we desire, pulls us toward a vision of the good life. And because of that, or the way that that works, is we are pulled by what we want. We are pulled into action by what we desire. We are pulled into a way of life by what we love. Practices, rituals, implant those wants. Practices and rituals, and what I'm calling liturgies, in a way, inscribe those desires in us. Just like they did in Olympus. Okay? They're not, we don't drop these desires into you. We might think that we can drop ideas into your head, but we can't automatically place desires in you in this way. So, that means love takes practice. So let me take a moment to think through some of the cultural impact of this. Love takes practice in the sense that the fruit of our love and desire, the formation of what you love, is in some sense impacted by and is the result of the practices that you are immersed in. And those bodily rituals and routines are getting to you. They are making some implicit vision of the good life, some implicit vision of the kingdom seep into your imagination and increasingly sort of loading it into your automated desires, if that makes sense. So, the first thing we need to appreciate then is that ritual is the means for a bodily formation of your desire. So, unlike Olympias' dualism, the body is the conduit to your heart. Now, here's the real upshot, to be, or not to be, no, but in your outline, to be. Cultural practices and secular religions. Here's one of the implications that I hope comes out of this. If practices, if rituals, routines do this to us, then what that means is that a lot of cultural practices that we otherwise thought were neutral, in fact are loaded. And they're loaded precisely because they are practices that want to make you love something ultimately. They are loaded and charged practices because they want to make you a certain kind of person. So, a big part of the middle analysis in Desiring the Kingdom is doing the work of sort of cultural exegesis, where I'm trying to get people to see something that they do every day with new eyes in order to see them as liturgies. And if you see it as a liturgy, then you will start to appreciate what's at stake in your participation. It's not just something that you do. Those cultural practices are something that do something to you. Okay? They're not just activities that you do, they are doing something to you. And in particular, they're trying to make you love something. They're trying to make you love some vision of the kingdom. I consider this a sort of apocalyptic project, right? The way I understand apocalyptic literature in Scripture, say that, the craziness of the book of Revelation, is that one of the things that John the Revelator is trying to do in the book of Revelation, by the way, I don't think he's trying to tell you what's going to happen after the rapture and things like that. I think what he's trying to do is show you this is what the world looks like from God's perspective. And so he writes to Christians, and he says, Rome is selling you a lie. Rome pretends to be the guarantor of peace, the beautiful picture of success, the fabulous embodiment of all that is the culmination of human civilization. And it's as if John comes along and says, I want you to look at Rome a little bit differently. Now, let me try a metaphor here. Do you know those kind of louvered blinds? Do you know what I mean? Like in a patio window, these sorts of louvered blinds that are long and narrow like this. And if you sort of pull the chain one way, all the blinds go like that, and you can see through them. Does everybody know what I'm talking about? This isn't some Grand Rapids thing, is it? So you've got these louvered blinds, these long louvered blinds, and when you close the blinds, they're shut like this. When you open the blinds all the way up, you can see right through them because it's as if the blinds are empty. But have you ever noticed that if you open those blinds 45-degree angles, on the one hand, if you're looking straight at them, you can't see through. But if you lean this way, you can see right through them. Does that make sense? Is everybody with me? So, I imagine that what John is doing in the book of Revelation is this kind of apocalyptic move where he says, look, the blinds are like this. Rome, and imagine there's like a picture painted on the blinds, and it looks fabulous. This is the culmination of all human civilization and success. And John says, do you think that's what's really going on? Come here. Come here. I want you to lean this way. This is what the book of Revelation is doing. The book of Revelation says, I want you to lean to the right a little bit. Do you see through there? What do you see? Three-headed monsters. All these ugly, the Whore of Babylon, right? All of these ugly things. I know they're giving you this really pretty face, and this looks like the epitome of human civilization and success. But if you look at this in a different way, you'll see that it's monstrous, and it's dangerous, and it's a threat, and it's the devil, and it's the enemy. Now, that's a little ramped up for what I want to do. But in some ways, I want you, for instance, I want you to come to the mall with me. And I want to invite you to look sideways at the mall. And I want you to see three-headed beasts and whores of Babylon. Right? Why? Because something like the mall, which is like, it's the mall. Right? I mean, I could do it with Walmart. I could do, maybe even Costco. The point is this. Those are not just neutral little spaces where you go get your stuff. The mall is a temple. It is loaded with liturgical practices. It has its own iconography. It has its own pilgrimage patterns. It has its own labyrinth. It has its own altars. It has its own visions of human flourishing. And the mall and all of its outreach in 30-second spots are all a liturgically charged attempt to capture your hearts and imaginations and make you the kind of people who love a certain vision of human flourishing, which is consumption upon consumption upon consumption. And it wants to make you think that you'll be happy that way. It wants to make you think that that's the good life. Right? And what I would also want to emphasize then in this apocalyptic leaning over and seeing it is I would hope, and this is, you have to buy the book. I would want you to experience, I hope, the tension between that vision of human flourishing and what the kingdom of God looks like. Now, I could do this all day. We could do the stadium. We could do the university. I mean, I'm just inviting you to see all sorts of cultural institutions and practices in new ways. To see what's at stake there, that they are really secular liturgies. Now, if we appreciate that these cultural practices are not just neutral things that we do, but are doing something to us. If we read them as worship spaces in some ways, then that also raises the stakes of what's going on in Christian worship. Because Christian worship, then, one of the things that should characterize Christian worship is precisely counter-formation to that formation. Right? That Christian worship should enact countermeasures to counter the formation of love that's happening in those spaces. That's, now, sadly, I wish I had more time to talk about this, I don't think very much Christian worship does that. Let me correct that. I don't think very much of our North American evangelical Protestant worship does that. And I say that as one, okay? Why? Because most of our worship is about ideas. Do you know what I mean? So, let me put this very starkly for you. If I'm watching a football game, I've never quite, well, I think I know why this is. If I'm watching a football game, have you ever noticed how many Victoria's Secret ads there are when you're watching an NFL game? Does anybody else notice that? It's strange. Not so strange though, maybe. Now, Victoria's Secret ads, they're not trying to like communicate ideas to you, right? But I think everybody appreciates that. There's a whole sort of story and imagery, and there's a kind of iconography of a Victoria's Secret ad that's trying to get hold of my heart and various other organs, okay? And sort of capture my passions and my longings, right? Now, the market and the mall is always trying to do that. The mall, you know what I mean? Volkswagen commercials aren't trying to sell you how good Volkswagens are. They're trying to make you picture you in a store, right? You want to be the person that's in that store, right? It actually works very affectively. It works at the level of the imagination. It works at the level of your heart. It works at the level of your gut. And then you come to church, and we're trying to sort of form you otherwise, but what we do is we give you 45 minutes of ideas and beliefs and doctrines, and we haven't done anything to sort of capture you at the register that Victoria's Secret ad has. We've just tried to pour a bunch of stuff into your head, and this ultimately is where my concern comes from Christian education and Christian higher education too. If we are going to be forming a peculiar people who desire the kingdom of God, it's going to be insufficient if we just keep loading ideas into your heads. We have to think about what does it look like to create practices that are going to make you love the kingdom. Not just the ideas to make you think about the kingdom. Because at the end of the day, what drives your action is what you love, not primarily what you know. So, get off way more than I can chew in 40 minutes, sorry. Very quickly, what would be some implications of this? I understand that some people get to hear Chris Smith was on campus recently doing some stuff on youth and religion. One thing, here's, and maybe this is more of a bone for faculty over here. If we took this liturgical picture of the human person series, I think it would have to change current paradigms in sociology of religion for this reason. Religion is not primarily a set of ideas and beliefs. It's a set of practices. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have ideas and beliefs, but those ideas and beliefs are the grammar of our practices. They are the articulation of what we are doing. I love what someone like Christian Smith is doing in trying to understand youth religion, but the methodology that's at work there is a survey. And so what you're primarily doing is asking young people to report and articulate their faith. What I'm saying is, if I want to know what young people really believe in, what their religion is, I don't need an ethnographic description of their practices. It will be, what they can articulate is not necessarily indicative of what they love. Right? So we would need to reshape that methodology. Very quickly, two other implications. And these are a little bit tougher. First of all, if what I'm suggesting here is in the ballpark of being right, church matters. And more particularly, how we do church matters. And sadly, I think most Sunday morning worship in your typical American megachurch is not doing this formative work. Because it doesn't appreciate that we are liturgical entities. So I think there are significant ways in which the church needs to think through what we are doing and why we are doing it. And then that feeds into the last one. What would a Christian college look like? What would a Christian university look like if this paradigm was somewhere in the ballpark of being right? Then what would define us as a Christian university is not primarily the content that we would be communicating, although that's an important part of it. It would be the vision of the kingdom that we are inculcating into people through the practices that shape who we are. And I think this is a very Wesleyan sort of principle, that this priority of love and thinking about orthopraxy, if you will, or something like that, is very close to the heart of the Wesleyan tradition. I think you have a lot of resources within your own tradition to imagine what would it look like to have a Christian university for love. Right? What if a Christian university wasn't made just to create thinkers, but to create lovers, and to prime and shape them to love the kingdom of God? Ultimately, we are called to be that peculiar people who love God, who love our neighbors, and even love our enemies. That doesn't happen by magic. Love takes practice. And I'm hoping with you, I think, for a Christian university that makes room for lovers. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Such a wonderful presentation. Also wonderful to be with you all here today. And I can't do it like Jamie in terms of the beauty of the lecturing. That was really fantastic, and it did place any respondent to him in a terrible position, which he must have known, but he didn't mention to me. And I'm responding also in many ways to his book, which I know many of you have read. Now, I thought that what I might could add to this today would be to take up a couple of biblical texts and just to explore a little bit with y'all, just to think about real briefly how these biblical texts help us think about what Jamie's been teaching us today. But I thought since I am from University of Dayton, I thought, well, maybe start with a deuterocanonical text from the Book of Wisdom, just so I bring in a little Catholic thing, just to make everybody happy that it is kind of a dialogic event. So I'm going to talk about the Wisdom of Solomon. And of course, as you know, those of you who've already taken your New Testament, you know that the Wisdom of Solomon is deeply influential upon Jesus as he talks upon St. Paul and so forth. So it's a deuterocanonical or apocryphal book. Now, the Wisdom of Solomon presents some certain unfortunate persons as reasoning unsoundly due to their moral wickedness. And it's a vicious circle. It's grounded upon practices of pleasure-seeking and violence. So I want to look at that vicious circle a little bit. According to the Wisdom of Solomon, it does begin with a certain mistaken apprehension about who they are. So a certain false knowledge. Now what is that false knowledge? Well, it's the same thing that you might find in Richard Dawkins or many other, Christopher Hitchens. And it's, let me quote a little bit from what are these people thinking about themselves. They say, "We were born by mere chance, and hereafter we shall be as though we had never been. Because the breath in our nostrils is smoke, and the reason is a spark kindled by the beating of our hearts." So they suppose then that their destiny is annihilation, right? They think this. For this reason, they find their good in pleasure-seeking, and anyone who finds a good in pleasure-seeking, will end up in a state of violent action against those who stop them from pleasure-seeking. So those who stand in the way of pleasure. And I'll give another quotation from Wisdom of Solomon. It says, "Let us take our fill of costly wine and perfumes." This is the kind of bad practice that Jamie was talking about, I wonder, perfumes must be associated with wealth as well. Interesting. "And let no flower of spring pass by us." Sort of sounds like romantic poetry, but "let us crown ourselves with rosebuds before they wither." And there, I'm going to pause to say that I think Orson Welles must have been thinking about that. Must be what rosebud means, in that movie, Citizen Kane. Okay, so it says, let us let us crown ourselves with roses before they wither. Let none of us fail to share in our revelry. Everywhere let us see signs of enjoyment, because this is our portion and this is our lot. So the goal then, they're thinking that the goal is to maximize their own pleasure. Then they say, they reason that violence is then justified. And I'm going to quote again from the Wisdom of Solomon. It says, "Let our might be our law of right, for what is weak proves itself to be useless." Think of abortion. "Let us lie in wait for the righteous man, because he is inconvenient to us and opposes our actions." And then it goes on, and they're going to put God to the test because of this wickedness. It says, quote, "For if the righteous man is God's son, he will help him and will deliver him from the hand of his adversaries. Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for according to what he says, he will be protected." Now, y'all, knowing the New Testament, you see the figure of Jesus here. The mockers, when Jesus was on the cross, they were readers of the Wisdom of Solomon. Now, I want to give another example from Scripture, and one I'm sure you're very familiar with also. It's from St. Paul in Romans chapter 1. And he also talks about this circular relationship between wisdom, or understanding, and love, what we desire. And he details the disordered worship, or false practices that result when the circle becomes viciously deficient. This circle between understanding and love that I'm talking about here. So in the first chapter of the letter to Romans, Paul argues that God's created us with intelligence and desire, so we might know and love God and worship. Even sinners cannot appeal to the weakness of our intelligence as an excuse for not worshiping God. So Paul says, I quote, "What can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, his eternal power and deity have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made." And so idolaters then they're without intellectual excuse, right? But he goes on, and he says that their lack of wisdom about the true good consigns them, it's grounded in false worship, right? And it consigns them to seeking the happiness that they desire by means of all sorts of disordered practices. Do you remember this? And Paul notes that we have all sinned in this way. So even it was, I guess, the Roman equivalent of the law, or yeah, this is very bad. So the gladiator shows were the equivalent of football, because unfortunately I'm a big football fan, and the commercials are really bad. What am I going to do? Can I tape them? I don't know what to do. Okay, so the main question that we can reflect upon, is which comes first? This kind of false understanding, or this false desire, this false love, or this false knowledge. Now, Augustine argues that repeatedly argues that one cannot love someone if one does not know that he or she exists. Now, for Augustine, we're created under the dynamism of intelligence, and he sees intelligence as a dynamism. Not just kind of an encyclopedia for facts, but as a dynamism drawing us toward what is real, and ultimately toward our Creator. So it's a dynamism of intelligence and desire and love that puts us in motion toward God. We're never in neutral then, except for maybe when listening to responses to interesting lectures. Then we turn into neutral and have kind of a near-death experience when you're kind of losing consciousness. I understand that's happened. Okay, so now, in a Christian university then, receiving God's truth and goodness and liturgy, allowing God's grace to transform our lives in repentance. In fact, we can devote formative years, I think this is important, in seeking to know more about our loving Creator and Redeemer and about all things in relation to Him. So in this way, I would say that Christian universities are particularly concerned with life of the mind. But this is not to say, though, that Christian universities are unconcerned with life outside the classroom formed by liturgical practices. Because, of course, we all know that the most important person at Christian university is the director of student life. Not at all academic deans or professors. So, in the Christian university, what I do think is that Christian Christian universities provide a place for students to enjoy time to contemplate God, contemplate the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and all things that the Trinity loves into existence. And this contemplation is never just simply the mere facts. You know, your learning in classrooms is not intended to be absorbing the mere facts. It's intended really to be the expression of your love, your desire for reality and for the source of reality. So, Professor Smith, and I would say, he embodies the joy and fruitfulness of contemplating in Christ and the Spirit, our loving Creator and Redeemer. And he shows us, I think, he showed us today, that in truly knowing our loving Creator and Redeemer, we grow in love for Him. And in truly loving Him, we grow in desire to know Him more and more, right? So we could end with another quote from St. Paul. I figure since I'm the Catholic one, I should quote from Scripture a couple times. I mean, well, Jamie's a philosopher, so he didn't have to. Okay, so let me quote from St. Paul one more time just to end the little response. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall understand fully, even as I have been fully understood. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. We just have a few minutes for questions. If you have questions, we can take probably about 2 or 3. You can just come on down to the microphone and do that. Yeah, why don't you come back up, Matthew? Do you want to come up as well? Questions? I'll bring the mic to you.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, glad to be here.
I had the opportunity to be able to read the book and then discuss it in a small group. And for me, the mark of good literature is something that when you're done, not only do you learn, but at the end of it, you have more questions than when you began. So I very much appreciated your book and that it left me with many questions. And part of that, as a person and as a member of the church, you made the statement that a lot of times our worship is informative, not formative, and thus we are not actually meeting people in a way that is beneficial and helping them grow. So in my personal life and in the life of the church, can you give a very brief, I guess, kind of what you would suggest? I know you talked about new monasticism and that concept, but just the elevator talk version, I guess, of what we can do.
Yeah. And in some ways, chapter 5 is trying to lay out what I think a model of Christian worship would look like that could do this, right? The one part that we have underestimated, perhaps, is time. So the whole genius of this formative thing is repetition. So for me, it's not primarily figuring out what new thing we could do that would change it. It's having enough will to sort of reincorporate old practices and just keep doing them and doing them and doing them and doing them. This is my refusal to answer your question, because I'm not sure, to me, the basic outline of historic Christian worship and all of those elements described in chapter 5 over time are what will do this for us. Now, that said, let's say, so that's basically, I don't think the church has to go figure out what to do. I think it just has to remember who it is. On a personal level, though, I think we can pursue all kinds of practices in communities of friends that incorporate the spiritual disciplines into our lives. And I think, by the way, I think dorms are just a golden opportunity to do that kind of thing. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm kind of not answering your. I'm a philosopher, so I just do abstract, and other people can do concrete and practical. But in a way, I sort of don't want to load the dice in that respect, too. Great question. You're welcome.
Another question.
Including in your lecture, I believe it was the second point, you said the church matters.
Yeah.
And how we do church matters.
Yeah.
So for you, what will shape the form of what we're doing in church? I mean, that's concrete.
What will shape,
What will determine it? Where does the imperative come from?
so, part of this is getting us to reappreciate the historic wisdom of the church, which I think, over time, through the leading of the Holy Spirit, developed elements of corporate gathered Christian worship that became crucial for inscribing in us the particulars of what the kingdom of God looks like. So, I mean, just to give you one example, because this is something that's really meaningful to me and that I didn't experience in my sort of Pentecostal evangelical background, right? The element of confession, the moment of confession in worship, and then assurance of pardon, to me is such a powerful formative element that runs counter to cultural liturgies in a significant way. For instance, the mall actually also wants you to feel broken. Right? The mall has its own sense of kind of sinfulness and brokenness, but it actually doesn't want you to ever feel pardoned or absolved, because it wants you to keep buying products and services to make yourself feel better for how ugly you are, how fat you are, how, you know, I mean, whatever it might be. On the other hand, Oprah wants to think, you've got everything you need, sister. Do you know what I mean? Just believe in yourself. You've got all the resources within yourself to, and the practice of confession in the church's worship counters both of those things. It says, no, you're kind of screwed. You can't do it. B, God forgives you and provides grace. So to me, it's again, I don't know if it sounds boring, but it's really just sort of retrieving and recovering historic Christian practices and making our churches look like that in some way. I think some churches are more primed to do that than others. Tell me if I'm missing your question. You sure? Go ahead. I feel like I'm missing the boat here. Okay. So why is that important? Yes. Okay, so here's why. Thank you. I knew I was listening. Look, I think, well, the primary purpose of worship is the worship of God. Okay, so I mean, I don't want to say that, I don't want to just instrumentalize worship. On the other hand, worship is also a formative practice that God calls together his people to make us his people. This is about, Wesley, do you care about sanctification? So this is about sanctification. This is saying worship is a means of sanctification. And I think that there is a specific wisdom embedded and loaded into the historic practices of Christian worship that have loaded into those practices some of the particulars of what God's kingdom looks like. And so the reason why we want to observe the imperative, if you will, is to make us the kind of people who look increasingly like that kingdom, a foretaste of that kingdom. And I think what we currently have in passages for evangelical worship is basically, you could be just a good American and have Jesus too. What I'm saying is, really thick, historic Christian worship will make you a bad American. I don't know how else to put it for you. If that makes you upset with me, that's okay. I just want you thinking about it, okay? Because I'm saying that there's an antithesis, there's a tension there between what our culture generally thinks of as the good life and what is human flourishing, and what historic Christian worship wants to make us into, that kind of people. And I think if we lose some of those elements of the practices, it's exactly why we so easily assimilate to that picture of human flourishing. That, at the end of the day, is what I care about. I'm Canadian, chalk it up to that.
We're going to have to stop there. We're out of time. Thanks for the enormous challenge that this presents, especially with our aspirations to offer a holistic learning environment here. Let's thank Dr. Lever and Dr. Spencer. What we thought.